Children are not being taught to think in terms of reality. They're being taught to think in terms of abstractions. Oppression, power, identity, privilege, resistance. They're being programmed to interpret the world through ideological categories rather than through experience, evidence, common sense, and moral judgment. This was never going to work.
It is already a bestseller. I'm so proud that the IPA has had the opportunity to support Bella in the preparation of this work and to promote this book as far and wide as we possibly can. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I now invite Bella to the stage.
Thank you, Scott, for that very kind introduction, and hello, Melbourne. It's so nice to be here. It's so nice to be home, where it all started. It's like coming back to see the family. So I've seen so many familiar faces this evening in the queue to buy the book. I really appreciate it. So again, thank you for coming, and thank you for your continued support of the IPA, because without you, there'd be no voice for freedom in this country. As Scott mentioned, the IPA has been in this fight about education, for many, many years, and often as a lone voice in the wilderness. We've been calling out this ideological capture of our education system while others have stayed silent. And it's precisely that long-term courage and consistency which is why the IPA is here tonight, and why tonight matters so much. And really, tonight matters so much because everyone in this room understands that something has gone very badly wrong with our education system. And I do mean very badly wrong. We're not dealing with just a few eccentric teachers or a handful of unfortunate lesson plans or the occasional activist who's wandered into the classroom and thought it was a political rally. We're dealing with something much, much deeper. I genuinely believe that the ideas now permeating our kindergartens and our schools and our primary schools and secondary schools now constitute one of the greatest travesties of the 21st century. Some of you will have come face to face with this through your own children or grandchildren. Some of you may have seen it at work, or perhaps you're still at school yourself. Or worse, you're in the middle of a Bachelor of Arts at the University of Melbourne. And wondering how on earth you're going to make it to the other end with your sanity intact. Unlikely. But wherever we encounter it, we have no choice but to confront this system head-on and ask some very difficult questions. What are we really doing to our children? What kind of madness are we inflicting on the youngest and the most vulnerable members of our society? And what kind of adults are we producing? Because this isn't ultimately just a battle over lesson plans or an argument about the national curriculum or the cross-curriculum priorities or social justice in teacher training or gender theory disguised as respectful relationships. Those are the details and those are the symptoms. They're important. But the deeper question is, what vision of the human person now sits behind our education system? Are we forming children to become free, responsible, literate, numerate, knowledgeable, morally serious adults who are capable of gratitude, judgment, self-command, love of family, love of country, and service to others? Or are we training them to see themselves as victims and oppressors, to distrust their inheritance, to fear the future, to politicize every single human interaction, and to regard Western civilization, our civilization itself, as something from which they must be liberated? Unfortunately, it's the latter. And that's why this matters so much, because it's not just a battle about what children are being taught. It's a battle over the formation of the child. Most parents, I would argue all parents, want their children to grow into well-adjusted, sane, literate, and numerate human beings. But the state has other ideas. It wants politicized, anxious children who are severed from their past, alienated from reality, and primed to regard the values and institutions of Western civilization as something to be loathed and destroyed. That's the real argument. It's about the kind of adult we're forming, and therefore the kind of society we're creating. In Mindless, as Scott mentioned, I don't just look at Australia, I look at the US and the UK. And what I found was not just a decline in standards, though there's a lot of that. I found exactly the same system being rolled out in every single country, where education has been completely repurposed. It's no longer really about knowledge. The progressives gave up that pretense years ago. It's about politics, and it's about forcing children to adopt political positions before they're old enough to understand them. They're being turned into political activists, and it's deliberate. Unfortunately, in Australia, this politicization starts in kindergarten. Through the government-mandated early learning framework called Belonging, Being and Becoming, well-meaning teachers, full of social justice fervour, are told to turn their small charges into, quote, active citizens in the journey of reconciliation. Very young children, children in nappies, are being drawn into rituals of permanent national guilt. National Sorry Day, National Reconciliation Week, NAIDOC Week, daily acknowledgements of country, classroom activities, apology cards, and tears. All carefully choreographed exercises in remorse. As well as that, they're becoming environmental activists, mini eco-warriors, found obsessing over recycling or telling their parents to turn their engines off as if their lives depended on it. And that's the thing. The system is telling them that their lives do depend on it. And worse, that it's their problem to solve. That same politicization, that same activism has infected every single subject in the national curriculum, where children are learning directly and indirectly that all the subjects they're taught are not neutral or objective bodies of knowledge, but manifestations of, quote, whiteness, morally tainted, politically dangerous, and in need of challenge, or to be deconstructed. In other words, in schools, knowledge is something children are told they do not need to know, because in knowing it, they're complicit in a system of oppression. The act of knowing becomes the act of oppression. But don't worry, children aren't simply left with no knowledge, they're offered another kind of knowledge, or should I say knowledges, or other ways of knowing, which are treated as equally valid. In the national curriculum, the dreaming is presented not simply as mythology or traditional or cultural inheritance, but as a living framework through which to understand the natural world. In biology classes, students are told that for millennia, Aboriginal Australians practiced perfect environmental stewardship. Fish traps are presented as proof of mastery of modern multidisciplinary science. Aboriginal Australians are declared the world's first astronomers, their star maps predating Copernicus by millennia. This is not a balanced education. It's the deliberate blurring of lines between mythology and scientific fact, treating them as equally valid ways of understanding the material world. I don't think this does children any favours. Because when we pretend that ancient mythology and empirical science are interchangeable, we're impoverishing them intellectually. And this brings me to one of the most important points in the book, which is cultural literacy. 40 years ago, an American educator, E.D. Hirsch, realized something profoundly important. He saw that children could be technically literate, they could sound out the words on the page, but they still had no idea what they were reading. Why? Because they hadn't been taught history, or literature, or religion, geography, civic stories, symbols, or shared references. They didn't know enough about the world around them that they lived in to make sense of the world in front of them. And this matters far beyond the classroom. It matters because a society needs shared knowledge. Cultural literacy is one of the glue that binds us together. This is why the assault on the traditional curriculum is so serious, because when we're severed from our historical inheritance, the historical inheritance of our own civilization, its religion, its literature, its art, its institutions, music, laws, political traditions, we become far easier to manipulate. Something else will always rush in to fill the void. And what has rushed in this time is identity politics and deranged theories about race and gender in history. Children are not being taught to think in terms of reality. They're being taught to think in terms of abstractions. Oppression, power, identity, privilege, resistance. They're being programmed to interpret the world through ideological categories rather than through experience, evidence, common sense, and moral judgment. This was never going to work. The danger is that when everything is presented as oppressive, children lose the ability to distinguish between the ordinary difficulties of life and genuine danger. When all knowledge is just dismissed as white supremacist or colonial, young minds are not being expanded, they're being closed. And when children are taught that nothing is objectively true, that every relationship is a power struggle between men and women, between parent and child, between teacher and pupil, they begin to lose grip on reality itself. And this is why we must pause and spare a thought for the young people themselves, who are truly victims of this vast social experiment. Many of them are anxious, confused, and increasingly aware, sometimes too late, that they haven't been properly equipped for life. They've been told endlessly about power, but they've been left powerless because they know nothing. I call this the tyranny of ignorance. And yet, this is not the time for despair, because to despair is to admit defeat. This is the time to fight. Because we're beginning to see the signs of that fight everywhere. As my colleague Colleen Harkin will testify, teachers are beginning to speak, sometimes quietly and cautiously, but they're speaking. In Australia, as Scott mentioned, we have Campion College, soon to be under the custodianship of John Roscombe. In Brisbane, we have St John Henry Newman College, and in Perth, there's a huge blossoming community of micro-schools, as well as Families for Australia, which is drawing inspiration from the American parental rights movements. Homeschooling, always the most difficult option, is becoming more popular across the country as numbers continue to rise. And the young people themselves are beginning to resist the sheer absurdity of what they're being taught, and they're rebelling against it. We see it in the next generation of IPA Academy, young Australians who are hungry for knowledge, truth, seriousness, and civilization. They are the future. But importantly, across Australia, Britain, and America, sensible people are starting to understand what this is really about. It's about the state making a claim over the child. This is where I hope the book finds its purpose. I wrote Mindless not to simply catalogue the madness, though there's plenty of madness to catalogue, but to show the deeper pattern. This is the steady transfer of authority from parents to state, from knowledge to ideology, and from civilization to activism. Over the last decade or so with the IPA, I've been exposing and opposing the changes that have been made to the curricula at Australian universities, schools, and kindergartens, and of course what used to be called teachers' colleges, which are now completely riddled with activist agendas. Compiling this book was a rare opportunity to bring all that evidence together, as well as to put Australia into a global context. We are not alone. Mindless is for parents, for grandparents, for teachers, aspiring teachers, and anyone who wants to understand what's happening inside our schools and why. The aim is to help people spot the signs, learn the language, and understand the code. And this is exactly why the IPA school program is so important. It's providing teachers, parents, and schools with an alternative, a positive, knowledge-rich resources that counter this ideology. But above all, Mindless documents what is being done to children in the name of social justice and progress. It records it so that no one can say they didn't know, so that no one can claim ignorance, so that when the reckoning finally comes, and it will, future generations can look back and realize what they were deprived of, and those responsible cannot say that they were never warned. But more than that, I wanted to remind people of something simple and profound. Children do not belong to the state. They belong to their parents. This is something we seem to have collectively forgotten as a society, and we needed to be reminded of it again. Just as we need to be reminded that what parents want for their children and what the state increasingly wants are two very different things. And this is where the hope lies. For all the damage that has been done, children still respond to truth, beauty, stories, courage, music, history, nature, faith, family, and the great works of civilization. The curriculum may have gone mad, but the human soul has not changed. Children are still capable of wonder. They still want to make sense of the world. And when they're given real knowledge instead of slogans, they flourish. They do not want to be politicized. So yes, this is a grave moment, but it's not a hopeless one. It will require courage from parents, honesty from teachers, seriousness from politicians, and institutions like the IPA willing to say what others will not. But it can be done. We can restore education to its proper purpose. We can defend childhood from the ideologues who are conscripted. We can reform schools and universities. And if they won't be reformed, we can build new ones that instruct rather than indoctrinate. And we can say, without apology, that our children deserve civilization, not ideology. Thank you.